Welcome to the Virtual Manager podcast. My name's Anna Russell. I'm an artist manager and founder of The Virtual Manager. Throughout my career, I've developed and managed several music artists from new unsigned acts right through to globally successful ones. This podcast is for all unmanaged or independent music artists who want to start, build, or grow a successful, sustainable music career. In last week's episode of the Virtual Manager podcast, we talked about goal setting and creating a strategy for 2021. And I'd like to start by thanking all the listeners who took advantage of the £1 14-day trial period in the Virtual Manager to attend the live workshop I held on setting your goals and creating your strategy for this year. If you missed that podcast episode, you can go back and listen now. And if you missed the workshop with me, you can watch it on replay in the Virtual Manager membership now. For most of you this year, your strategy is likely to include several new music releases, meaning that you'll want to factor those releases into your strategy and timeline for the year. So I thought this would be a great topic to follow up on last week with. But when is the best time to release new music? Are there any times you should avoid? And how far apart should your releases be spaced? That's a question I get asked a lot. So I'm going to be answering all of those in this episode for you. For those of you who are self-releasing your music, there no longer seem to be many rules as to when is or isn't a good time to release music. In theory, you can set up a release via digital distributors for any date at all. However, this can often make planning release dates more confusing than not. It is really important to remember that there are no definitive answers when it comes to selecting your release dates for the year. So what I'm going to be giving you today is just a guide. It's not the rule. However, there are some things you should bear in mind when planning your releases. Firstly, your single EP or album releases should never happen in isolation of your other artist activities for the year. They should be complementary to all your other music plans so that the releases can be optimized. For example, if you're going on tour or playing a summer full of festivals or showcasing at one of the new artist music conferences this year, you probably want to have a release coming out shortly ahead of these because it will be beneficial to both. Each will help you promote the other. And of course, having new music out that people have had a few weeks to get familiar with and fall in love with will really help you sell tickets or drum up excitement and interest in the gigs that you have coming up. So always make sure that when you are planning your release dates for the year, you're doing it very much in conjunction with your other artist activities for the year and try to release at the points that make most sense for you. Secondly, where you and your fans are located is something you definitely want to take into consideration. Wherever that is, you want to avoid major holidays or large world, cultural, or local events where possible. I suggest making sure not to clash with major holidays for the territories that you're releasing in, such as Christmas, Thanksgiving, Valentine's, etc. And you probably want to steer clear of public, national, or bank holidays as well. If you have a song that you think is perfect for any of these events, release it ahead of time, allowing time for you to promote the song and people to find it by said holiday. You'll also want to avoid things like general election days, major sporting events like the World Cup and similar, as again, you can assume that people's attention will be firmly elsewhere on these days and your release might end up not getting the traction that it could have done on a different date. Next, the day of the week matters, at least as far as your fans and your online promotion efforts are concerned. For example, it's likely that your fans are offline more during weekends and are distracted by the week's work on Mondays. The last thing you want is to be posting and promoting a brand new single on a day where it's going to go unseen. As you likely know, the universal new music release day has become Fridays, and I largely advise keeping to this as music fans are trained to look out for new releases on Fridays. Sticking to Friday may also be wise if official chart positions are one of your goals. However, there is also something to be said for releasing on an alternative day if you want to avoid your release being lost amongst the literal noise on a Friday. It can allow you to stand out from the crowd a little. With this in mind, you could consider looking at a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday release instead. But generally, I advise avoiding Saturday to Monday releases. The style and genre of the music you're releasing can also matter when it comes to release days. For example, which season of the year do you feel that your single, EP, or album best suits? Has it got an upbeat, positive, summery feel to it? Or has it got an undeniably wintry, colder, darker feel to it? Is your forthcoming single perfect for running or working out? In that case, you might want to aim for a January or February release date. Whatever it is, do take into consideration the actual music that you are releasing, its sound, its style, and its genre, because this can also influence the release dates you pick based on what music fans, listeners, and consumers are looking for at that particular time. Finally, you want to think practically. Remember that you'll need to have adequate time and be available during release campaigns to promote your releases as effectively as possible. Therefore, you also need to factor in your other commitments and that of your band or teammates if you have them. Finally, think practically. Remember that you will need to have adequate time and be available during release campaigns to promote your releases as effectively as possible. Therefore, you also need to factor in your other commitments and that of your bandmates or your team if you have them. Conversely to the first point in this episode, being on tour, for example, is not necessarily a good time to release music. Every waking moment of the day is going to be consumed with loading in, sound checking, playing, and then traveling. So you're not going to be available to be promoting the single and be in front of your devices or on the phone doing promo during that time. You want to avoid your release dates clashing with important events in your life or dates when you just aren't going to be able to work exclusively on the release, so that you can give each of your releases the best possible chance. All of this to say that as a general rule, in the Northern Hemisphere, I advise remaining within a release period from mid-January to early November. Obviously, if you're in Australia or New Zealand, you're probably going to be working counterintuitively to that. Any earlier than mid-January, and people haven't really re-emerged from the Christmas and New Year break yet. Any later, and you're veering into Christmas music release territory, competing with more major label releases, which typically happen in Q4 of the year, and contending with the inevitable end-of-year music polls and the music industry generally winding down. The second half of January and February can be a particularly good time for new artists to release because music fans and press and radio tend to be more open to discovering new music at this stage of the year. As the year goes on, the release schedule can become a little more saturated and people's attention becomes slightly more scattered. March and April can also be great months to release, though for US artists or artists hoping for US music coverage, you should be aware that both the South by Southwest and Winter Music Conference festivals happen over there in March. Therefore, most of the US music industry and the music media descend on those places for those weeks. For those of you in UK and Europe, I think that these can be great months to release in, especially if you're planning on showcasing at any of the new artists and or summer festivals, which by this point are just around the corner. May, June and July are fine to release in, especially if you're playing at summer festivals and or you have a summery sounding release. Though if you're hoping your single is going to be a summer hit, you definitely want to be releasing it towards the start of this period, not the end. However, August is a month I try to avoid for releases because typically many in the music and media industries are on holiday or certainly less responsive for the majority of this month. Again, you'll find people's attention quite scattered and you'll probably receive lots of out-of-office emails. September and October are great months to be releasing music in, especially for early stages artists. People have that back to school feeling, and again, they're a bit more receptive to brand new music and discovering new artists. Historically, October and November can be busy touring and gig periods as well, so having a release that precedes these is often a good idea. Whilst you can still release into November, from the 1st of November onwards, you'll start to see a lot of Christmas and holiday releases beginning to flood the market. If you have a Christmas or holiday song, this is your time. But for everybody else, I try to avoid kind of releasing from mid-November onwards. Now it's time to start planning your releases for 2021. So are you releasing an EP or album this year? And if so, how many singles are you planning on releasing from that body of work in order to build anticipation for it? Or are you simply planning on releasing a string of singles this year? If so, how many and when? Once you've answered these questions, it's time to work out how much time you will have between releases. Now, I don't like to be too prescriptive on this, as it really depends on the type of artist you are, your goals, activities, genre, and much of what we've already discussed in this episode. However, as a broad general guide, a single release every 8 weeks or thereabouts works well for most artists. Much less than that, and you may not be leaving yourself enough time to execute and promote the release effectively. Plus, you can sometimes overwhelm your fans with too much material. Much more than 8 weeks, and the momentum and the algorithmic build-up you've created with the last release will dissipate somewhat. Remember, though, that this is just a general guide. You don't need to stick to it rigidly. By penciling in your release dates now, you can work these into your strategy for the year and have adequate time to prepare everything required for a successful music release campaign, including creating all the assets that you'll need for each release. Now, as a bonus to this podcast episode, in the Virtual Manager, I have today published some of the dates that you may want to avoid and plan around when it comes to your releases in 2021. If you're not already a member of the Virtual Manager, now is your chance to check it out risk-free. If you join any time in January, you actually get a 14-day trial period membership for just £1. That's versus the usual joining fee of £24. So to take advantage of this offer and to check out those dates to avoid for your releases this year, join now at thevirtualmanager.co.uk. In the meantime, I'll be back with another episode of the Virtual Manager podcast next week. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Virtual Manager podcast. If you found it useful, I invite you to check out the Virtual Manager membership site, an essential resource for independent artists who want to start, build, or grow a successful, sustainable music career. Everything you hear about on this podcast, we show you how to do in there. With monthly music industry training, a library of tools and resources for you to use, A&R feedback on your music, access to live Q&As with me, plus an active, supportive community of like-minded artists, the Virtual Manager is the perfect place to be for any unmanaged or independent music artist. Check it out now at thevirtualmanager.co.uk. Finally, please take a minute to review and subscribe to this podcast. It helps more independent music artists to find us.